Vikrant Karveer. I'm a repeat entrepreneur. With me, I have Madhav Gopal, who is a hands-on operational technical CISO, been there in financial services, telecom industry, also, helping with a couple of healthcare startups. Lucky to have him out here.
As you said, I'm a hands-on CISO. So I think what's interesting is that I've worked at a, Fortune 30 company, but I've also worked in a startup with like 50 folks under, right? Also a ton of experience in consulting, operations, technology audit. One of the things that I'm really excited about is kind of looking at insider threat from different aspects, and I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
And then we have Ganesh Krishnan, who's been an operational hands-on practitioner as well as CISO at various well-known tech companies. And then more recently, he's been a repeat entrepreneur in the security space.
Thank you, Madhav. Thank you, Vikrant. Glad to be here. My background is primarily also in as a cybersecurity practitioner for over 2 decades, CISO at companies like Yahoo, LinkedIn, Atlassian, and then most recently, founder of a couple of startups. So glad to have this topic at hand and looking forward to the discussion.
So let's get started with this, right? I'm going to refer to the Verizon data breach report for 2024, which essentially says that 68% of breaches involved a non-malicious human element. Now, this is not a net new news for CISOs or for our security teams. Conceptually, as a veteran CISO, you guys have been into this, doing this for a while. What are your reactions to this finding? Is that surprising? More importantly, why does this happen so frequently? I mean, this has been going on for a while. And then there are questions tied to this is human element an overlooked element by the security community? And what can we do about that? Maybe we'll start with you, Madhav, and then go to Ganesh, and then we can.
Absolutely. First of all, I'm not surprised at all. If you look at insider threats, they've been around for literally 2,500 years since the first Trojan horse kind of walked into. If you look at that, now we have all this technology that's overlaid, all of these different processes, right? Especially when you look at a lot of companies, there's so much complexity. I think recently it's also very easy to perpetrate this kind of attacks, because if you look at any of the social media, any of the online, sources of information, there's a lot of information about me. If you Google me, for instance, you can find where I live, who I work for, what do I do, ton of information, right? So attackers can use that, right? Number one, to do these kind of attacks on me, right? To get me to accidentally or negligently give up information. But also, there's a lot of malicious, someone can be solicited to telegraph, for instance, to kind of give up the credentials, right? So all examples are there. And I think it has taken off more recently because there's a significant motive, right? There's a lot of financial motive around these kind of attacks where threat actors can really make out big.
So it's almost been institutionalized by the threat actors. The technologies and the automation, especially with generative AI, has pushed essentially the productivity of this, attackers to the new level. And on the other hand, you have the situation of breaches, right? Ganesh, what's your reaction on that? Can you build up on that concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, when I first heard that stat like several years ago, I fell off my chair up, right? Because it's like, okay, does this actually invalidate all the things that I had been doing before? When I was a security practitioner, we spent most of our time protecting from the outside in. Like, how can we, strengthen our exterior perimeter, 4 walls, to make sure that the attackers don't get in? And that's where even now most of the investment goes in. But what the attackers are doing, and, of course, they're smart and they like to stay steps ahead of the defenders. And with the advent of Gen AI, it's actually made their lives easier, actually going after insiders within companies, because it's easier to get humans to make mistakes, use their access to basically get a much, much more stronger foothold into the enterprise. So that's where the game is.
Conceptually, when we talk about insider risk, we kind of equate to basically human or user risk. And oftentimes that is the purview of malicious insight. Now, as you guys think about user risk, right? What's the best way to think about the universe of user risk, right? Why, insider, is that the big one, or are there other areas that we as security practitioners need to think about, look at it?
That's a great question. Whenever we use the term insider risk, typically the first thing that comes to mind is, hey, bad employees or malicious employees or employees trying to steal the data, right? So that's one type of insider risk, I would say. It's the malicious employee case, which I would say maybe it's around 5% ish of the actual insider issues that happen. Practitioner and in most CISOs I speak with, they hear from their legal department once or twice a year saying somebody's leaving, we need to watch over them, they might take stuff. Once in a while, stuff comes in the news. So, I mean, it is a problem, but it's 5% of the problem. There are other types of insider risks that actually don't get that much attention, which is where the attackers are really honing in on. The second type of insider risk, I think, is the accidental insider, right? This is basically where employees make mistakes, just genuine mistakes. A good example is humans share password. So an employee can end up reusing the same password that they use at their company at a third-party site. And so if the third-party site now gets hacked, the attacker's going to try the same password against the company. That was the employee wasn't being malicious, they accidental mistake, right? The third type of insider risk is negligent insider risk. So this is where employees really want to get their work done. I mean, ultimately, you want to run the business, and in some cases, security controls can come in their way. So to give you an example, an employee, let's say, file sharing is blocked at a particular company. Like I'm not allowed to share files outside the company, and it so happens that I have a business need where I want to communicate with an external third party that we work with. I want to share something with them. What am I going to do? My boss is evaluating me on it, asking me to do it quickly. I'm going to download that file from the company drive and then upload it to my personal drive and share it through my personal drive. I'm not malicious. I'm just trying to get the work done. So in this case, it's a negligent error where I thought, you know what, this is fine. Like the security guys block stuff all the time. We can get around it this, right? So those are the three types: malicious, accidental, and negligent.
And the example you used, that has been around for more than 10 plus years, right?
Yes.
With the advent of collaboration. Madhav, what's your take on this, right? Can you talk about, accidental, negligent, in addition to insider, right? How you see this, examples, real, perspectives out here?
If you look at it, a lot of times employees are just trying to do their job. Some examples that come to my mind is, hey, you had an admin for a CFO, right? She got a call from the company's IT saying, hey, we are running into issues. We need to kind of help him enable his account. He's on stuck on an airport somewhere, and she surrenders, her credentials, right? She's able to kind of give up not just a password, but also the MFA token, right? So sometimes employees are just trying to get things done. They're under a lot of stress. There's a lot of psychological. That's on the negligent on the side of the business, but also on the malicious side, Ganesh said, hey, they might be 5%, but they're pretty high impact, right? If you Capital One breach from 2019, right, we're talking about 100 million plus customers whose information was kind of exposed because you had this AWS contractor who basically was able to use a vulnerability in the WAF, in the AWS WAF, to kind of download all this information, right? I don't even want to get into details of Edward Snowden and the NSA files, but that was another pretty juicy example, right? So those are small number. When they happen, they're pretty significant. On the negligence side, what I've seen is that typically, yes, it happens with well-meaning employees trying to do something and it kind of blows up on them. The good news is that a lot of times you're able to detect those big issues because employees also are tuned into this. I had a case that my team was investigating a couple of years back. An employee was on the call with the threat actor for 15 minutes and they were screen sharing and stuff, and after some time they were like, this doesn't seem right, and they actually kind of hung up and then they called the SOC almost immediately, right? So it is kind of a lot of these factors that go into when employees are trying to do what is needed.
So in the world of distributed workforce, in the world of hyper collaboration, using various kinds of services, in the world of where AI is becoming part and parcel, human non-human identities and all that, right? Just from a user perspective, user risk perspective, and maybe Ganesh will flip it over here again, or maybe ask you what are the new attack vectors that you guys are seeing, right? I mean, feel free to jump in, maybe Madhav, Ganesh, what do you guys see on the horizon right now that is now and present danger in most environments?
Yeah, I can go first. So what I've been seeing the last 2 or 3 years now is just a widening envelope. So it's not just your employees and your users, it's your third parties and your fourth parties, right? So if you have a call center in Guadalajara, Mexico, employees there, and look, with COVID, everybody's kind of working from their home. They're not in a clean room anymore. It's much more easier to kind of track them and then to get them to kind of give up their credentials, do that, right? right? So it's become very important for companies to understand what are the different risk vectors, how do you address them, and this is something that you are not going to be able to solve overnight. You just have to rinse and repeat. You have to have the drumbeat of communications around that, and you have to use a variety of defenses, right? So the whole concept of defense, endpoint security, email security, but also training, phishing campaigns, all of those things become super.
Interesting. Very nice. Well, Ganesh, you?
Yeah, I think I would agree, right? So like it has to be a multi-pronged approach. One of the things I believe that is missing currently in the arsenal that security teams have today is this notion of a common understanding, a source of truth of what humans are doing within the company. And that isn't to blame them or find fault. That is really just to understand risk, right? So if, for example, you realize that, hey, 15% of your employees are falling for phishing simulations every time. Let's say that you already have that stat, perhaps if you're using a phishing tool. Now you can join that data and say, oh, out of those 15%, 80% of that 15% has SMS-based MFA. Then you might say, oh my God, I need to put the guardrail in place. I need to move all those people to pass. I can make sure that the chance of them compromising their identity is much lower, right? And so those types of tools, I feel, are missing. The other thing is, as the identity protections get stronger, the attackers will adapt. And what attackers are already doing is basically getting employees to do other things, not just give up their password, but things like getting them to install fake software, rogue browser extensions, and so on. So that's why it takes a multi-pronged approach to, one, understand what the risk is, two, have enough data and source of truth to basically put the right guardrails in place, because that's what most security teams are looking for in employees, but they'll still make mistakes. But if you can take common mistakes and turn it into a guardrail, that's much more
interesting. So taking a step back, right, what you guys are saying, like, hey, different individuals within the organization have different roles and privileges across the board. A lot of that information can be gleaned from social media. So there can be lot of social engineering analysis automated, done by the external threat actors, number one. And number two is like, let's build up on the example, right? Simple, two-factor authentication can be basically compromised. So you go into MFA, right? A multi-factor authentication. But now if the devices have a rogue malware sitting on that itself, essentially those sessions can be compromised, and that high privilege user's session can be compromised. We are seeing a lot of examples of that where the admins are compromised and therefore the access to systems is compromised, or basically, there is data sets that just not available, right? A whole bunch of attacks, right? Going across the board, right? Conceptually, if you have to think about, how should the industry go about, addressing this issue, right? So one aspect of this is, yes, there is a lot of attention and focus goes on inside us, and those are high value cases. But across the board, you have a broad user population, and Ganesh, maybe to your point on source of truth, is there a systematic effort in the industry to unify the user risk into a source of type of concept?
I think it kind of comes down to data to really say, okay, what is important to the organization? Who has, and then kind of goes back to what Ganesh was saying earlier as well about this whole concept of user and behavior analysis, right? Okay, I am Madhav Gopal, I'm the CISO. I may have access to the accounting data, but I shouldn't really have any business reason for doing that. And if I'm looking at it, if I'm downloading it, right? So really, and you can kind of relate it back even to zero trust. Zero trust is at the device level and saying, okay, what does it take for you to get access to this? So almost the same way you have these detection and prevention controls that are very fine-tuned, right? I, Madhav, should not have access to this beyond this time frame, right? I should not have access to this beyond, right? So those kind of things become super important. The other thing is, I can't test this enough. It's a habit, right? Insider threats happen because people have bad habits. People have, behaviors, people have impulses that they want to address, right? So you really have to condition the behavior. You really have to coach them. And it gets less into cybersecurity and more into human learning, really driving that point home, right? It needs to be it takes a village, right? It needs to be the whole organization. It needs to be human resources. It needs to be legal. It needs to be, the business unit themselves driving, saying, hey, this is, we have this data that's so important to us. We have to safeguard it, not just from, outside attackers, but also from us, right? Again, going back on my history lesson, 200 years ago, the Battle of 1812, right? An American general very famously said, we have met the enemy and the enemy is us. So really taking that approach that, hey, we have to protect the company, things that we do either intentionally or maliciously.
Yeah, and it's just building on this. So Madhav, just great points over there, right? Building on this, right? Typically, you're running a security team. Most of the times you're in a firefight. I mean, most of the time that's your life, right? You're reacting and reacting. That you have few opportunities to be proactive. Now, Madhav, to your point, right? Unifying this data from various different tools, let's say 5 tools or 15 tools, is a gargantuan effort. If you have the resources, a lot of teams are doing it. Is there a better way of doing this, if I may, right? Is there any other model that one needs to think about as we think about this problem?
Yeah, I mean, the organization can find different ways of doing this, right? The point that I would make is that do organizations understand their actual human? Because what we tend to do in security is to impose controls on the organization. Ultimately, that's what it is. And then you try to balance. If you can balance those controls, back that up with real data, then nobody's going to push back on those controls. If you go tell your exec saying, look, X is happening, like so many people are, downloading files locally and uploading it because we have X, Y, and Z control in place or don't, then nobody's going to actually push back on implementing certain types of controls. Where we find ourselves right now is, a lot of times when at least when I was doing it, like we do security training and compliance mandates and so on and so forth, people will just check the box because they really don't, none of that is backed by data. Nothing, even the effectiveness of those things doesn't get measured. So for instance, we do cybersecurity training for developers as a very specific case, right? When we do all that training and when we subject developers to all that pain, then do we actually measure in the next 6 months, okay, what percentage of our developers are actually become better, right? What else do we need to do? Do we do that closed loop? Those are the kinds of things we need to do better to understand the risk better, to enforce the right controls, and to be proactive. Because if we had that data, then we could say, hey, 5% of our developers are still creating security problems in cross-site scripting. Maybe we should go ask engineering to build some guardrails in place, right? Something like that, right? So that doesn't exist. And so that's because the data doesn't exist, the risk assessment.
So your point is, instead of trying to boil the ocean out here, we're trying to unify or whatever, the focus should be what will be the objective of unifying this. And what I'm hearing from you guys is the first step that you do is have a clear auditable data through which you can have a guardrail of controls-driven, security controls-driven conversation, either with your sales organization, your customer support organization, or your development. And the guardrail-driven conversation to be more focused on, okay, which controls are working well, which controls are not working well, and which controls are missing because you got, for example, a SaaS, rogue SAT, or a shadow IT, or a data sharing problem in your, and that's the starting point of saying, okay, we need to put some structure and some guardrail on some of the issues that we are seeing so business can continue doing what it's doing and security can do its job of protecting that price inside. Building on that, right? What are the, so a lot of companies essentially, try to do this, right? What are some of the challenges when you tend to have these type of conversations with business, right? I mean, can you guys talk about that, right? In terms of controls and, what does it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that I've seen is that you have to be careful to avoid knee-jerk kind of react, right?
Mm-hmm.
The example that, comes to my mind is a while back, at a company where I was, working and there were like 12 different sales posts, right? And there was this new vulnerability, hey, Salesforce attachment can be used to infect malware. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, the IT organization decided unilaterally, hey, let's prevent all of these, thousands of Salesforce from, uploading attacks. That was a disaster, right? Because you can't do that, right? You have salespeople going, door to door, getting information, getting network diagrams, getting, receipts, right? And then preventing something like that overnight is just not the right way to do it. So a lot of times, some of these initiatives fail because either we are not listening to actual users as to what they're doing and how to make that secure, as opposed to saying, okay, this is how I think it should be secure, right? Yep. Or it's just that, to Ganesh's point earlier, we are not taking a data or risk-based approach to kind of really mitigate the risk there in terms of how you do this. And then explaining to users why. And many times, listening to them and saying, hey, you salesperson in the field, you're in, Lansing, Michigan, you need to do these things. Are you able to do this? Like maybe they don't have a reliable connection where they are, and, they have to use cellular, right? So all of those things kind of go in, and then you have to really figure out, hey, the solution that my team is designing, does that work, or what can we do to kind of mitigate?
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with Marvin. This is the trap that I personally fallen into many times, right? Like just do these knee-jerk vulnerability-based or technology-based or best practice-based mandates or policy, if you will, right? And say, oh, I think we need endpoint, we need MDM, we need insider threat, we need X. And by the time you get done, you end up with 4 agents on everybody's machine and everybody's complaining, saying this sucks, like what is security thing? But then, if there was a different way to do it, say, okay, what is the business? What is the risk? What are users doing? If I could actually understand and then say, okay, what is working well? Then I don't need to worry about it. I can monitor what is not working. And then that's where I need controls. That's the best way to go about it.
So all teams are not, let me put it this way. Different teams have different business priorities, different cultures, different needs. So the security controls and guardrails that may work for one team may actually have. So how do you create that? And then different team is or different individuals are at different level of security. Maybe question, is the industry ready to build some becomes sort of like a user risk. I mean, there are so many different risk scores across the board from one tool to another tool. But across the board, do you guys see any, movement in the industry to say like, hey, we have some, 12 or 15 variables to which we are basically going to make a user risk, and that, you can customize the user risk or user score to different teams organized, set up guardrails. Have you guys seen that? Can you guys talk about?
Yeah, I think the example that I have seen that has worked very well is gamifying the whole process. Right? It's using things like leaderboards. So yeah, yes, you have the concept of the credit score, but when I think of my credit score, I'm in panic mode if I see a change, right? So I think really saying, okay, yes, this is a score associated with you, but it's actually something that you can get more points. If you don't click on this phishing email, you get 50 points. If you do all your cyber training, you get 100. But also things like that. If you go help the other users on how to use a password manager, you get like 200 points, right? So those kind of things kind of really fit in very well. And it goes to the point about what you said, right? Using data to build a profile, but incentivizing your users, your employees to use it in a very constructive manner.
Absolutely. I mean, I would echo that. The other thing that I would say is the term we are talking about insider risk or insider threat. It generally has had a negative connotation. And I don't look at it that way at all. Like what Madhav said is like to the point, like you cannot win in this game if you're against your insiders, like if the insiders are playing against you. So you literally have to flip it and say, well, how do I get my employees to help and be transparent about and be privacy preserved? Like if you are collecting data about employees, like tell them like this is what we are doing. This is exactly what's being collected. And that's actually not very commonplace in the security, right? So you want employees to help you in this process. And that's where, things can be more successful. In terms of industry effort for a risk score, I think there are lots of products in the security space. We all know some of those products have started creating those scores in their individual area. Not that many tools that try to pull together and add their own intelligence. That's just been my experience.
Once you essentially get an inventory, or let's say hypothetically, you basically aggregate the user risk into a single source of truth, understand what controls are working, not working. What happens after that? How do you actualize this, right? Is training the only solution, or are there other scalable, remediation?
Yeah, I think training obviously is one solution, but I think you can use that score to do more creative things like, okay, you have access to this high confidentiality material because your score is not great. Maybe your manager needs to approve this every time, right? So creating a little bit of barrier, I don't think is a bad thing, right? The other thing that also becomes important is you have to be careful with using that kind of information because you're the CISO or you're the security team. You have to work with legal, you have to work with HR to make sure they kind of bless any kind of action. Going back to Ganesh's point about privacy and especially in high performing organizations, you can't just shut down things right off the bat, right? So you really have to have a very coherent logic and be able to explain the rest to your users as to why this action is being taken. But yeah, no, it definitely comes down to being very clear and transparent about some of these stuff.
So explainability is critical, auditability is critical, collaboratively, sharing that information, right, with legal, HR, and the business lead is very critical.
And just to add to that, I think the training point, I would echo that, right? If you have this kind of data, it's a great opportunity, educate your employees, right? Not just push some training content at them because right? That's the one important thing. The second thing is you can use such kind of scoring and data to prioritize. And the third is you can use such kind of data to implement guardrail in your environment. So if there is really a case, so for example, half the employees are going and signing up for a few SaaS applications in the same area, you could say, hey, you know what? Like, let's purchase the most commonly used one. Let's have them go through our SSO. Let's pay for it so that employees get what they want. And that's a fine guardrail that enables the business because we can see that a lot of people are doing that, right? So it kind of works both ways.
So to conclude the session, any parting thoughts on the broader area of human risk, user risk, insider risk?
Yeah, I think my main takeaway here would be, look, to all the listeners, every organization is different. And sometimes within the organization, there are differences in the business units. So you really have to understand what works best for your teams, but it has to take a data and risk-based approach, right? And also, in my mind, insider threat is like a game of chess. You have to stay a few steps ahead, right? You have to anticipate both malicious and, the negligent behavior and say, okay, these are the potential things that folks can do, right? As Ganesh said earlier, right? You might put data on a personal Google, drive, right? So how can we prevent that? And how can we take away the need for doing something like that by making sharing super easy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I would echo as I've been throughout, like what Madhav said. And I think like taking a risk-based, data-based approach to this problem actually help, in my mind, protect the organization as well as enable the business because it kind of cuts both ways. And I'll leave it there.